Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I think we're live, so let's kick off. For those new here, my name's Nicki. I'm an author and editor and I post videos here on YouTube about writing, editing, reading and all the other things I love. We're here for the reading for this vlog. It's the end of the month, so it is time to share with you all what I've been reading during April. This was a reasonable reading month, but I read a few slightly longer works, so I've only got 16 to share with you. I think it is about today, so it will be a little bit shorter than usual, which you'll all be much relieved about, I'm sure. So kicking us off, I read The Joke by Milan Kundera. For those of you who have been familiar with my streams, you'll know I'm quite a fan of Kundera's work, and I just decided there were a few I still hadn't read, and I decided it was time to fix that and just fill in those little gaps. So I think after this one, I think I maybe have one or two to go. I'm not sure. I've got to double check, but I'm nearly there, catching up on all his works, at least all those available in English. The Joke is his first work, and it's essentially a story of a young man in communist-run Czechoslovakia, as it was at the time, and he has written a postcard to his girlfriend in which he's made fun of the communist government. Now, this was only intended as a joke, as the title of the book suggests. However, because of that, his life takes a very drastic turn. I don't want to give too much away, but there are elements here of a kind of revenge story when he comes back in later life, getting revenge on people he feels have wronged him in the past. And there's also this sort of look at the communist regime as well. I won't say too much more. It's a 5-star read for me. I do love Kundera. He manages to write very simplistic prose, but that has a lot of deep thought and really sort of gets your mind working in the background. It's quite emotional storylines, and you really get a sense of the characters and understand their situations and feelings through his writing. Moving on, I read Viking-Age Iceland by Jessie Byock. This is a book that kind of draws on a lot of different factors. It uses the sagas to some extent as a basis for a discussion of life in Viking-Age Iceland, in particular social and political life, economics as well. It's not so much what did people wear, but more where did they get their money from, how were the communities organised and things like that. So as I said, it draws on the sagas for illustrations of different points, but it also looks at sort of anthropological and archaeological evidence as well. So it's, in some ways, it's a little dry. I wouldn't recommend reading this book unless you're desperately interested in Viking-Age Iceland. For me, it was 4 stars. I did enjoy it. I found it interesting. I liked that blend of the fiction with the sort of archaeological evidence. However, it wasn't the most thrilling read from cover to cover. There were odd chapters where I kind of skimmed a little bit because it just wasn't piquing my interest as much as others. So it is a little bit dry and academic at times, but it's still interesting if this is a subject that appeals to you. So moving on from there, I'm just scanning down my list here. I read The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel. So this is the final book in the Wolf Hall trilogy. This was a 5-star read for me. I've adored this trilogy. I had an interest in Thomas Cromwell even before this trilogy came out, and I'd read a couple of biographies about him. But I really loved how Mantel portrays him in this series. I love her prose, the way it takes a little bit of getting used to in the first book, the sort of Cromwell stuff. But once you get into it, it works really well. And I find her descriptions brilliant. I mean, the importance of fabric and colour and things like that, and animal motifs in some ways as well in the series is great. So if you like historical series and you don't mind some big weighty books, then definitely check out the Wolf Hall trilogy. After that, scanning down, I read Star-Crossed by Allie Therin. This is the second book in the Magic in Manhattan series. It's an LGBT fantasy series. And I really enjoyed this. I think it perhaps didn't have quite the spark of originality of the first book, but then that's because we're coming back to the characters and the worlds we knew from there. The plot was still good. It wasn't quite as gripping, but it's still really enjoyable. I liked the continuation of Rory and Arthur's relationship. I thought that worked really well and was nicely handled. It's not an insta love, you know, they're taking things slow, getting to know each other, and I really appreciated that aspect. For me, this was 4 stars. If you like fantasy, this is set in the 1920s, so it's kind of historical fantasy, then definitely check it out for a gay romance series. Next up was, 10 Count. So I previously read volume 1 of 10 Count by Takarai Rihito, this is a manga. It's a boys' love manga. And I finally got around to buying and reading volumes 2 to 6 to finish the series. So the premise of this series, in some ways, is rather topical at the moment because our main character is a germaphobe. He doesn't want to touch anyone. He wears gloves. He wears masks, which we're all doing to a certain extent at present. So he meets this guy who's a counsellor who offers to help him. But as you might expect from a boys' love manga, a romance soon blooms between them, and we start getting into some slightly racy scenes once he's helping him overcome his fear of germs and touching. So I really like this overall. There's 1 or 2 elements, which happens quite a lot in boys' love, or from what I've seen of boys' love so far. I'm still fairly new to it, but that there's a certain amount of dubious consent here and there. So if that bothers you, then this manga might bother you. But for the most part, that's not a problem. And it's really, really enjoyable. I liked seeing him dealing with his everyday life with this germophobia. And I enjoyed their relationship development as well. There's a little bit of sort of dominant, submissive aspect as well in this. So if that's not your cup of tea, then this is probably not serious for you. But if you don't mind that, I do recommend checking it out. Next up, I read The Book of Tea by Okakura Kakuza. Now, this is an older book, I think early 20th century from memory. At the time, Westernization was happening, and this book is interesting. In some ways, it's a history of the tea ceremony and the way it developed in Japan. But at the same time, it's also a bit of a mockery of the Western's skewed view of the East and anything Oriental. You have to excuse me, I've suddenly got an itch on my nose. This was a 4-star read for me. I found it really fascinating, particularly to see how the tea ceremony developed over time and the differences that different religious practices and things brought into it. Next up, I read 2 books by Mishima Yukio. Now, for those of you who've watched some of my previous streams in February and March, you'll know that Mishima is an author I've recently discovered and fallen in love with. And I'm going to get rid of this banner because it's just started to really annoy me. So there we go. Okay, so first up, I read Confessions of a Mask. Now, this is essentially a gay lit story. Our main character is dealing with his feelings of homosexuality, which in the society of the time are very much taboo. And it's how he tries to come to terms with that. So in some ways, some people might find this a little bit confronting because of he kind of goes into some dark places as he tries to come to terms with his feelings. But if that doesn't worry you and you're not likely to be triggered or upset by that, then I definitely recommend this book. It was a really interesting look at someone dealing with coming out, or in this case, not coming out, in a sort of LGBT repressed society. So it was a 5-star read for me. Really enjoyable is the wrong word for it, but a really engaging and thought-provoking book. And also by Mishima, I read Spring Snow. Now, this is the first book in the tetralogy he wrote just before his death. He died by seppuku, ritual suicide after a failed coup, actually. They all led really exciting lives, actually, some of these Japanese authors I've been reading from this period. And nearly all of them ended up committing suicide, or attempting to commit suicide. And this book is about a young man from kind of the Nouveau Riche. It's set around early 20th century, 1912-ish, I think. And he's in love with the daughter of an aristocratic family who have fallen on hard times. So you have there the sort of confrontation between this sort of aristocratic past and the nouveau riche coming in. And there's also a look in the book at the effect of increasing westernization and the way that caused a sort of cultural division of those who were more traditional with those who were embracing the new changes. It was really brilliant read, 5 stars again, and I'm definitely keen as soon as I get around to buying them to continue reading the other 3 books in this series. Next up, I read Basic Korean. There's several authors. It's a Tuttle publication. Kim Soo-hee, Cho Haewon, and Emily Curtis are the authors of this book. Now, some of you may know I've been learning Japanese since August, teaching myself, and that's been going well, but I've been watching so many Korean dramas, as you all know if you watch my TV and film wrap-ups from the last few months, that I kind of became interested in wanting to understand Korean a bit more as well. So I've been trying to learn. I've actually, I don't know if struggling is the right word, but I'm not picking it up as quickly as Japanese, let's just say that. I find the grammar really straightforward and obvious because it's very much like Japanese. So that all makes a huge amount of sense to me. I'm not getting on too badly with the alphabet. I'm a little bit, it takes me a little while to think it through before I can pronounce things, but I'm getting there. But the thing I'm finding is I'm not remembering vocab and verb endings very well at the moment. But I think part of that is the fact that I am still really deeply busy studying Japanese as well. And there's probably only so much my brain can take in. So although I'm continuing with the Korean studies, I'm only doing a tiny bit of that. And I'm really still concentrating on the Japanese. And my plan is to continue doing that at least till the end of the year. And then next year, I'll sort of assess where I am with the Japanese. If I feel I've made some really good progress, then I might dial that back a little bit in order to concentrate on the Korean more. So we'll see. It's going to be a work in progress. I'm not expecting to become fluent in Korean in the next 2 months or anything like that. But I am still doing a little bit, and I'm interested in learning more in the future, in the near future. So Basic Korean for me was a 4-star read. I think it had some good grammar explanations. There were times when I felt it rushed on a bit too fast, which I think is also the trouble I've been having because I've been working with Duolingo a little bit on Korean, and it's throwing a huge amount of stuff at you very quickly, more so than the Japanese one on Duolingo did. And so I think it's kind of too much to take in all at once. And this book I got because I'd already bought a Korean Essentials grammar book, but that was too advanced for me. So I got this one, Basic Korean, hoping that would help more. And I think it will. But I think, again, it is just too much for my brain to take in all at once while doing Japanese and trying to memorize kanji and everything as well. So it's 4 stars. I think it was nicely set out. I liked the inclusion of the little 1 or 2 page mangas illustrating situations of the characters having dialogue and going through different things. So I'm going to come back to the book. I've read through it once, but without really spending time studying, doing the exercises and things. So I am going to come back to it again later to look at it in more depth. Next up, I also read, I'm skimming through a couple because some of the things I read are some manga, but I'm still ongoing with the series, so I'll talk about them when I'm completely finished. Next up, okay, Natural History by Carlos Fonseca. In fact, have I forgotten to tell you any were from NetGalley? Let me have a glance. Starcrossed, sorry, was from NetGalley. All the others were ones that I bought for myself. So, okay. But now we're moving on to, I think, Everything Left. Yes, Everything Left that I'm going to mention now until the end of this video is from NetGalley. So the first of those is Natural History, as I said, by Carlos Fonseca. And I chose this one because it actually crossed off another country on my attempt to read a book written by an author born in every country in the world. So I'm actually I've got up in front of me on the screen here the blurb, because as I was getting ready for this video, I was like, how on earth am I going to describe this book to you without spoiling? So I will just read you out a little bit of the blurb. Just before the dawn of the new millennium, a curator at the New Jersey Museum of Natural History receives an unusual invitation from a celebrated fashion designer. She shares the curator's fascination with hidden forms of the animal kingdom, camouflage and subterfuge, and she proposes they collaborate on an exhibition, the form of which itself remains largely obscure, even as they enter into a strange relationship marked with evasion and elision. So, the main part of the narrative takes place 7 years later, and the designer has died, and the curator has received back the archive of their never completed project. And during his look through the archive, he finds clues to the designer's past, to her family life. And that is really all I can say about it. I'm sorry, without going into too much detail and ruining it. It's one of those books where you kind of just have to read it, I think. For me, it was a 3.5-star read. There were things I found absolutely fascinating about it. It was really interestingly constructed, the structure of the novel, the way the story wove or unwove, as it were, through the text. Interesting group of characters. But for me, it didn't quite gel with me 100%, which is why it gets 3.5 stars. It was fascinating. I found it a really interesting literary attempt. Attempt makes it sound like less completed than it was, but I'm just struggling to decide how to describe it. It was a little bit of an avant-garde approach, let's call it that. And it's probably not going to work for all readers. Not everyone's going to appreciate it. So if you want something very different that's really going to make your brain work, then check out Natural History by Fonseca. Next up, I read A Flood of Poesies by Tiffany Meuret, or Meuret, depending on how we're pronouncing her surname. Now, this is a fantasy, post-apocalyptic kind of thing. And I have to say, first of all, this is a 2.5-star read for me. I loved the idea. It's set in this world where there's been this flood. Only a few people have survived. They're living as best they can on rafts and boats and various things. And in the water are these creatures that they've called Poesies, who come up and attack them. At the same time, there's this drama going on between two estranged sisters who were brought back together as the flood took place, trying to survive. And it had great potential, but it just didn't come together for me. I never really got into the family drama, and I had too many questions about the fantasy or post-apocalyptic elements that were not answered. And I really did find myself skimming through pages of this. I did finish reading it all, but I read it quickly in places, particularly the in-between past scenes. It felt like it had so much potential to be really good, but it didn't quite come together. And I didn't love the prose style. So for me, it's not one I highly recommend. Next up, I read Self-Portrait with Russian Piano by Wondratschek. If I can say it, Wondratschek. So this is a book about a man who's trying to interview a Russian pianist near the end of his life, who is now living in Vienna. And it's another one of those books that, like Natural History, I can't really tell you too much about it without spoiling it. So I'm going to keep my explanation short. But it basically turns into this question of who's interviewing whom and whose life is the one being put on display and being discussed. So there's a kind of back and forth between the two of them, with the Russian pianist being evasive and the reporter or the interviewer wondering exactly where he stands in this relationship. So it's a really fascinating piece. This was a 4-star read for me. It's an interesting work of literary fiction. And if you like that kind of interplay between not quite knowing what's going on and who's in charge of events, then this is definitely one I recommend. It's got a kind of dreamy lyrical quality about it. We're nearly there. We've got 4 to go. So next up was volume 1 of a manga, which I am going, because I'm not planning on definitely reading the rest of it. I will talk about it. It's No Vampire, No Happy Ending by Shinya. The premise of this story is there's a girl who lives in a village that's full of vampire legends. She's a bit of a vampire obsessive. And one day she actually goes up to the castle where a vampire supposedly once lived and meets one. However, she's rather disappointed because he's not at all as she imagined. He's a little bit ditzy. He doesn't mind going out in the day. He'd rather eat apple pie than blood. And she decides that she needs to mold him because she wants a vampire romance of her own. And it's not going to work with this guy. She needs to make him a more traditional vampire first. At the same time, vampire hunters turn up. So there's a bit of action going on there as well. I gave this 3.5 stars. It was interesting. I liked the plot idea. It was quirky and fun, a little bit silly, and perhaps a tiny bit too silly here and there. And as for the illustration style, it was okay, but I didn't absolutely love it. So it's one, if I came across volume 2 and I was able to read it, I wouldn't refuse to do so, but I'm not going to rush out to look for it. Next up, I read The Frightened Ones by Dima Wannous. Apologies if I'm saying that wrong. This was a 4-star read for me, and this is another one I read because it ticked a country off my list. So this is a story about 2 people, essentially, who begin a relationship after they both meet at their psychiatrist's office, and they're both being treated for depression, among other things. And this is kind of post the Syrian revolution. So it's an intriguing look at mental health, and I thought that aspect of the book worked really well. It was a very decent, again, I'm just searching for the right word. It was a realistic, decent, and nicely handled portrayal of mental health, I think is the best way to say it. And this book also had a kind of unreality lyrical sense about it, because we get the girl's backstory, and that's interspersed with sections from a novel written by her boyfriend. And the lines begin to blur about what is her story and what is the fiction of this book that the guy has written, how much of it's real, how much of it is made up. As I said, really interesting. It's another one I can't say too much more without ruining it. But if you're into literary fiction that looks at topics like mental health and post-traumatic stress and things like that, then definitely give this book a try. Next up, I read The Ghost Variations by Kevin Brockmeier. And this is a selection of 100 short stories all about ghosts. And some of them are very short, just a few pages each. I gave this collection 4 stars. This is not a hiding under the covers at night kind of book, but it does have a mix of stories that some of them are quite spooky, some of them are a little bit psychological, thought-provoking, others are funny. So if you like ghosts and you like an interesting mix of stories like that, then I definitely recommend checking this out. It was, as I said, a 4-star read for me. And finally, we have A Family Affair by Rob Loveless. And this is a gay romance. And our main character, Cal, was in a relationship at college. And after he slept with the guy disappeared. And it's really affected his dating and his view of relationships ever since. And one day he goes home for a dinner to meet his sister's new boyfriend, only to discover it's that guy. It's his ex. Christmas is approaching and they've all been invited to join him for the season. And he's going to have to deal with seeing this ex all the time. And he begins to plan a way to sort of make him regret dumping him in the past. This is not one to read if you don't like stories that include infidelity, because there is a little bit of that going on, or quite a lot of that in terms of one of the characters. But I thought it was really good. It was a 4-star read for me. I liked the story idea. I thought it was well presented. The characters came across well. And it has a positive ending, let's say, after all the drama and all the bad things that go on. So that was my wrap up for April. I'm busy reading more at the moment, so I will be back at the end of May, hopefully, with another vlog for you to tell you what I've been reading in the next few weeks. But I say hopefully because, as I mentioned on my film and TV vlog, if you watch that, they're installing the national broadband network in my area. And my house is due to be done towards the end of May, based on the current schedule, if all goes to plan. So I've already signed up for a new plan, so hopefully the transition will be smooth. But at the very least, I will have a few days without internet and potentially 1 to 2 weeks, depending on worst case scenario and how long the changeover takes place. So it may be that affects my ability to come and do these live streams on my usual time frame for you. But if I don't make it at the end of May, don't worry, nothing's happened to me. It will just be the internet. And I will be back as soon as I can. And it may just be I have to do them in early June, depending on how things work out. So I will be back with my May wrap-ups. I have a couple of vlogs scheduled during May before then, and those are all set up on YouTube already, so they'll go ahead regardless. But for these live streams, just bear with me if I'm a little bit late. So on that note, I will close. I've got a ton of things on my to-do list, and I better get on with them. I will end there for now, but I will see you all again very soon with another vlog. Bye for now, everyone.